From the outside, our life was a masterpiece. In the polished Boston suburb of Brookline, Ethan and I were the couple everyone pointed to, the handsome finance manager and the thoughtful art historian, living in a restored Victorian with a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. Our life was a carefully curated exhibition of success, but only I knew the curator was a vandal, and every beautiful scene was just a canvas for his next act of cruelty. Ethan had a particular fondness for what he called pranks. They were his specialty, little acts of psychological warfare disguised as jokes. He thrived on the jolt of panic in my eyes before the punchline landed, the moment of chaos only he could resolve. It was his way of reminding me that he was the one in control, the one who could giveth and taketh away. I remember last spring, the night before I was scheduled to give the keynote speech at the New England Art Symposium. It was the biggest moment of my career, the culmination of 2 years of research. I had rehearsed for weeks, my lecture notes filled with color-coded tabs and scribbled insights. That evening, as I did a final run-through in my office, Ethan came in, kissed my head, and told me how proud he was. An hour later, my notes were gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I tore the office apart, my heart hammering against my ribs. Ethan watched from the doorway, a look of faux concern on his face. "Maybe you misplaced them, Claire," he'd said, his voice maddeningly calm. "You get so absent-minded when you're stressed." He helped me search, his hands always looking in the most obvious, useless places. By midnight, I was in tears, convinced my career was about to implode. That's when he pulled the neatly stacked pages from inside his own briefcase. "Found them," he announced with a brilliant smile. "They were on the kitchen counter." "You gotta be more careful, honey," he then added, with a wink. "Just wanted to loosen you up a bit. You were getting too tense." I felt sick, but I smiled and thanked him, because that's what I always did. So, when Ethan walked in 2 weeks ago, holding 2 first-class tickets to Rome, my first instinct wasn't joy, but suspicion. He'd been distant and irritable for a month, consumed by a high-stakes project at work. I had been walking on eggshells, carefully managing his moods. Now, here he was, presenting this grand gesture with a flourish. "A 10th anniversary surprise," he declared, his voice booming with performative generosity. "I know I've been difficult lately. This is my apology. 10 days in the Eternal City, just you and me. No work, no stress." He painted a beautiful picture. Moonlit walks past the Colosseum, private tours of the Vatican, dinners in hidden trattorias. It was the trip I had always dreamed of, the one I'd described to him years ago. He had remembered every detail. Against my better judgment, a fragile, cautious optimism began to bloom in my chest. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the fresh start we needed, a return to the man I thought I had married. My best friend, Sophie, was less convinced. We sat in our usual coffee shop the following day, the tickets a glossy rectangle on the table between us. She looked at them not as a gift, but as evidence. "So, he ignores you for a month, makes you feel like you're the source of all his problems, and then expects a first-class ticket to erase it all?" she said, stirring her latte with more force than necessary. "It's his classic move, Claire. He breaks a window, then buys you a new house so you'll thank him for it." "It's not like that this time," I argued, though my voice lacked conviction. "He seems genuinely sorry. He wants to reconnect." Sophie just looked at me, her eyes full of a sad, familiar concern. "I hope you're right," she said softly. "Just be careful. With Ethan, the grander the gesture, the sharper the knife." I squeezed her hand and promised I would, dismissing her words as I always did, because clinging to hope was less painful than facing the truth. I wanted to believe in the masterpiece, even if I knew the paint was poison. The moment we stepped out of the taxi, Rome enveloped me. The air itself felt different, thick with the weight of millennia, smelling of espresso, ancient stone, and blooming jasmine. For an art historian, it was more than a destination, it was a pilgrimage. My exhaustion from the flight vanished, replaced by a thrumming, palpable excitement. Every cobblestone, every ochre-colored wall, every sliver of a hidden courtyard seen through an iron gate, was a piece of a story I had studied my entire life. Ethan, for his part, played the role of the perfect, indulgent husband flawlessly. He handled the check-in at our luxurious hotel overlooking the Piazza Navona, charmed the concierge into upgrading our suite, and ordered champagne to our room. He was attentive, holding my hand as we took our first walk, listening with a focused intensity as I pointed out the genius of Borromini's architecture in the Church of Sant'Agnese in Agon. For those first 24 hours, he was the man I had first fallen in love with, and I allowed myself to believe Sophie had been wrong. The unsettling undercurrent began with a small, seemingly practical gesture. As we prepared to go out the next morning, he held up a sleek, black travel bag. "Everything goes in here," he said, his smile unwavering. "Passports, wallets, credit cards. Rome is notorious for pickpockets. I got this, it's slash-proof, RFID blocking the works. I'll be the quartermaster for this trip just to be safe." I hesitated, my hand on my own purse. "I can be careful," I started to say. "Honey, don't argue," he said, his tone shifting from charming to firm in a heartbeat. "Let me take care of you. Isn't that why we're here?" I relented, dropping my wallet and passport into his bag, feeling a familiar, quiet surrender. A small cold knot formed in my stomach, but I told myself it was just jet lag. Later that morning, over cappuccinos at a cafe, he unveiled his grand plan. He reached into his bag, the secure, theft-proof bag, and pulled out a beautiful parchment-style envelope sealed with wax. "Your anniversary scavenger hunt begins now," he announced, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "I've spent weeks on this, Claire. A series of clues designed just for you. They'll take you on a journey through the heart of the city. And the final clue will lead you to the most incredible, romantic anniversary dinner of your life." My heart did a little flutter. It was thoughtful, creative, and centered entirely around my passions. It was the ultimate romantic gesture. "Ethan, this is amazing," I breathed, genuinely touched. "I know you'll crush it," he said, beaming. "But there are rules. To make it a real adventure, we do this separately. I'll be following my own set of clues to get things ready at the final destination." He then handed me a small, cheap-looking mobile phone and a €50 note. "This is your adventure kit. The phone only has one number in it. Mine. Call me when you solve each clue, and I'll give you the next one. And the cash is for gelato or a taxi if you get stuck. But try not to use it." He laughed. "It's more of a challenge that way." It all sounded so whimsical, so romantic. I was so caught up in the performance that I didn't see the bars of the cage he was building around me. He slid the first envelope across the table. I broke the wax seal and unrolled the parchment. It wasn't a simple riddle. It was a photograph of a small, obscure detail from a sculpture. A specific curl of marble drapery. Below it was a line of text. "Where the angel's sorrow offers the only way forward." I knew it instantly. It wasn't one of the famous crowded sites. It was from a lesser-known Bernini funerary monument in the Church of San Francesco, Arepa, a sculpture of the Blessed Ludovica Albertoni. The sorrow was the statue's expression of divine ecstasy, often misinterpreted as grief. The way forward referred to the street the church was on, a path leading deep into the Trastevere neighborhood. It was a brilliant, complex clue that only I, with my specific knowledge, could have solved so quickly. A genuine, warm smile spread across my face. He saw me. He had listened to all my ramblings about obscure art and forgotten masters. In that moment, he had given me the one thing I craved most: validation. "I know where it is," I said, my voice filled with excitement. "I knew you would," he said, leaning over to kiss me. "Now go. Your adventure is waiting." I watched him walk away, weaving through the crowded piazza, and felt a surge of love and gratitude that eclipsed any doubt. I was so focused on the cleverness of the bait that I never once suspected the trap. The bus ride to Trastevere was a sun-drenched dream. I felt like a local, navigating the city's arteries with a newfound confidence. The Church of San Francesco, Aripa, was just as I'd imagined, a quiet haven tucked away from the thundering crowds. Inside, Bernini's sculpture of Ludovica Albertoni was breathtaking. A masterclass in marble that seemed to breathe with life. I stood before it for a long time, feeling a profound connection to the art, to the city, and to Ethan for sending me here. My pride was a warm, glowing thing. He had seen the real me, the scholar, the historian. This entire day was a testament to our connection. Filled with a giddy sense of accomplishment, I stepped back out into the sun-drenched piazza, pulling the cheap burner phone from my pocket. My fingers were trembling slightly with excitement as I selected the single contact, Ethan, and pressed call. I imagined his cheerful voice, the playful praise, the next clever clue. The call didn't ring. It went straight to a flat, sterile tone, followed by a recorded message in rapid-fire Italian. I didn't need to understand the words to know the meaning. Disconnected. Confusion came first. I stared at the phone. Maybe the network here was bad. I walked to the other side of the piazza and tried again. The same deadening tone. I tried a third time. A fourth. A fifth. A frantic rhythm of hope and failure. The warmth of my pride began to curdle into a cold, creeping dread. It had to be a mistake. His phone died. He dropped it. There was a logical explanation. There had to be. My first instinct was to get a taxi. To get back to the hotel. To the safety of our room where he was surely waiting. Worried sick. I hailed the first one I saw. The driver, a grizzled man with a kind face. Piazza Navona, I said. My voice shakier than I intended. He nodded, but then pointed to the meter and said something in Italian, gesturing with his hands. I understood the universal language of money. I opened my wallet and looked at the €50 note Ethan had given me. It felt like a fortune that morning. Now, as the driver shook his head and quoted a price of €70 for the cross-city journey, I saw it for what it was. A pittance. Not enough. Humiliation washed over me as I apologized and got out of the cab. The journey back was a confused, stressful blur of navigating bus schedules I couldn't quite decipher. The endless ride on a crowded, sweltering bus felt like a punishment. Every stop a small delay in finding out the truth I was becoming increasingly terrified to face. My frantic rationalizations grew weaker with every passing minute. 2 hours later, disheveled and drenched in a cold sweat, I burst into the opulent, air-conditioned lobby of our hotel. The cool air was a shock. The concierge, a man named Alessandro whose name I remembered because Ethan had made a point of over-tipping him, looked up with a polite professional smile. "Signora Thompson," he said, his smile faltering slightly as he took in my distressed appearance. "Is everything all right?" "My husband Ethan," I gasped, leaning on the marble counter. "Is he in our room? My phone isn't working, I got lost." Alessandro's expression became one of carefully practiced neutrality. It was a look I knew from my work in museums, the look of someone about to deliver bad news about a priceless broken object. "Signore Thompson is not here," he said softly. "Not here? Is he in the bar? The restaurant?" The concierge cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes. "No, signora. Mr. Thompson checked out this morning. About 3 hours ago." The words didn't compute. They were just sounds, hanging in the air. "Checked out? No. That's impossible. We're booked for the whole week. There's a mistake." "There is no mistake," he said, his voice now laced with pity. "He settled the bill for your one-night stay, and the remainder of the booking was cancelled. The charges have been reversed from his credit card." My blood ran cold. Cancelled. Reversed. The finality of the words was absolute. This wasn't a mistake. This was an action. Deliberate. Alessandro then reached under the counter and produced a familiar, crisp white envelope, the same kind Ethan had used for the first clue. My name was written on the front in his sharp, decisive handwriting. My hands shook as I took it. I tore it open, my fingers clumsy. Inside, a single sheet of hotel stationery. The note was short, written in the same breezy, carefree tone he always used after a prank. Pranked ya? Gotcha good? Figured you could use some character building. See you back in Boston in a week. Try to survive. The lobby seemed to tilt. The concierge's face blurred. The ornate chandeliers swam above me. The entire, beautiful, romantic trip, the scavenger hunt, the thoughtful clue, his concern for my safety, it was all an elaborate stage for this singular, devastating act of cruelty. I wasn't his partner. I was his punchline. And the joke was that he had left me, penniless and powerless, to rot in a city of strangers, 4,000 miles from home. I don't know how long I stood in that lobby, the cruel note clutched in my hand. The world had become a distant, muffled roar. Alessandro, the concierge, was speaking to me, his voice gentle, but I couldn't grasp the words. Someone, a kindly hotel guest, guided me to a chair. My body moved, but my mind was still back in that moment of reading, trapped in the loop of betrayal. Humiliation was a physical force, a hot, creeping flush that started in my chest and spread through my entire body. I was a fool, a spectacle, a punchline in a 5-star hotel. Somehow, I found myself outside on the street. Rome, which had seemed so magical an hour ago, now felt like an alien planet. The vibrant colors were garish. The cheerful chatter of tourists was a grating mockery. Every smiling couple was a personal insult. I was adrift in a sea of humanity, more alone than I had ever been in my life. No passport, no phone, no money, no home. Ethan hadn't just stranded me. He had erased me. My feet, acting on some primal instinct for survival, carried me towards the one place I could think of, the U.S. Embassy. The walk was a trek through a nightmare. The grand monuments I had dreamed of seeing, the Pantheon, the Trevi Fountain loomed like monstrous judges. After what felt like hours, I stood before the imposing building. A fortress of American soil that promised safety. The reality was a soul-crushing lesson in bureaucracy. I waited in a long, slow-moving line, surrounded by other people in varying states of quiet desperation. When my turn finally came, I stood before a thick pane of glass, speaking to a tired-looking official who had clearly heard every possible sob story. I explained my situation, my voice cracking, the words tumbling out in a torrent of panic. He listened with a practiced patience, his expression unchanging. "Do you have a copy of your passport?" he asked, his voice flat. "No," I whispered. "My husband had it." "Any other form of U.S. government-issued photo ID? A driver's license? A state ID?" "No, he had my wallet. He had everything in his bag." The official sighed. A small, weary puff of air. "Did you file a police report? For what, my husband playing a prank?" The word tasted like ash in my mouth. He pushed a stack of forms through the slot at the bottom of the window. "You'll need to begin the process for a lost or stolen passport. We'll need a signed statement. Proof of citizenship like a birth certificate, which we can help you obtain from the U.S. And you'll need new passport photos. The entire process, without any identification to verify, can take several weeks." Weeks. The word hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't offering a rescue. He was offering paperwork. There was no magic button to press, no emergency flight home. I was just another number in a queue, another problem to be processed. I stumbled away from the window, the useless forms in my hand, the last shred of hope for a quick escape gone. I was well and truly on my own. I ended up on a bench in the Villa Borghese Gardens, the manicured beauty of my surroundings, a stark contrast to the ragged chaos in my soul. I had nothing. Less than nothing. I was a ghost. I sat there as the sun began to set, watching families laugh and play, feeling a despair so profound it was almost peaceful. I finally understood what it meant to hit rock bottom. I was clutching the one possession I had left from the hotel, the art history book I'd been carrying when the day started. I traced the embossed title with my finger, and then a memory surfaced, faint at first, then sharp and clear. My mother's voice, from years ago, After a bad breakup in college. Always have your own way out, Claire. A little bit of money that no one but you knows about. Never give anyone complete control. It had been her mantra. My breath hitched. My fingers fumbled with the back cover of the thick hardcover book, prying at the cardboard lining. For years I had continued her habit, a secret ritual she had taught me. Tucked deep inside a slit I'd carefully made in the cover was a flat, cool rectangle, an emergency credit card. It was in my name only, linked to a small account I'd kept since college, with a limit of just $500. Pulling it out felt like an act of resurrection. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine. It was a lifeline. It was proof that somewhere, buried deep beneath the compliant wife I had become, a part of me had listened to my mother. A part of me had been preparing for this exact moment. With this tiny flicker of power restored, my mind started to work again. I couldn't afford a hotel, but I remembered reading about convents in Rome that offered simple, safe lodging for women. My Italian was clumsy, but I managed to ask for directions from a street vendor. He pointed me toward a quiet, unassuming part of the city. The door was a heavy, ancient wood. A small, smiling nun with kind eyes let me in. She didn't ask questions. She simply saw a woman in distress and showed me to a small, spare room. I paid for 2 nights in cash, which I took from a nearby ATM. The transaction, the simple act of using my own card to secure my own shelter, was the most empowering thing I had done in a decade. The room was Spartan, a narrow bed, a small wooden desk, a crucifix on the plaster wall. As darkness fell over Rome, I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, and finally, the dam of my composure broke. I wept. I wept for the humiliation, for the fear, for the 10 years I had dedicated to a man who saw me as a plaything. The ghosts of all his other pranks filled the small room, the lecture notes, the time he'd jokingly told my entire family I was pregnant, the 100 other small cruelties I had absorbed and excused. But as the hours passed, the weeping changed. The hot tears of grief turned into the scalding tears of rage. My sobs weren't for my lost husband anymore. They were for me, for the intelligent, capable woman I had allowed to be diminished, for the countless times I had shrunk myself to make him feel bigger. Sometime before dawn, the tears stopped. The rage cooled, and what was left was not despair, but something hard, clear, and cold as steel. Resolve. I looked out the small window at the sliver of a sleeping city. He had expected me to panic, to fall apart, to call our friends and family begging them to find him, to rescue me. He was sitting back in Boston, waiting for the story of his wife's frantic, helpless ordeal to unfold the grand finale of his prank. He wanted me to come crawling back, broken and grateful, and in that silent Spartan convent room, I made a vow. I would survive, but I would not be coming home. He would not get the ending he had written for me. I woke to the sound of church bells, a sound so ancient and foreign it took me a moment to remember where I was. The gray light of dawn filtered into the Spartan convent room. The despair of the previous night was gone, replaced by an unnerving, crystalline clarity. I was not a victim in a tragedy. I was the protagonist of a story Ethan had tried to write for me, and I was about to tear out the page and start a new chapter. He wanted me to crawl back. He wanted me to break. I would do neither. That satisfaction would be denied him. My first move was not to the embassy or an airline office. It was to an ATM, where I withdrew a precious €20 from my dwindling funds. I walked through the waking city, past the produce trucks unloading in the piazzas, and the shopkeepers rolling up their metal grates. I found what I was looking for on a narrow side street. A small, dusty art supply shop that smelled of turpentine and old paper. Inside, I bought a simple, wire-bound sketchbook and 3 sticks of charcoal. The purchase felt more significant than any I had ever made. It was an investment not in survival, but in my soul. Art was my language. My first love, the part of me that Ethan had never been able to touch or tarnish. In this moment of utter crisis, it was my only comfort and my only weapon. I didn't go to one of the grand, tourist-choked squares. those places were tainted with the memory of my arrival with him. Instead, I found a small, unnamed piazza with a crooked fountain at its center, where a few locals were drinking their morning coffee. I sat on the stone steps of the fountain, opened the fresh, clean sketchbook and began to draw. I didn't draw the grand architecture, I drew the details. The intricate pattern of a wrought iron balcony, the way a vine snaked up a crumbling plaster wall, the weary but proud face of an old man reading his newspaper. The act of observation, of translating the world into lines and shadow, was a meditation. It silenced the frantic, screaming voice of panic in my head, and focused me. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I wasn't Ethan's abandoned wife or a stranded tourist. I was an artist at work. My focus was so complete that I didn't notice the small crowd that had gathered behind me. A young couple from Australia whispered about the life in my sketches. A German tourist pointed to the drawing of the old man and asked, in broken English, if it was for sale. I was so startled that I simply nodded. He pressed a 10-euro note into my hand and took the page, thanking me profusely. It was the first money I had ever earned from my art. It felt like $1 million. Across the piazza was a small bakery, a panificio, with a faded green and white striped awning. From behind the counter, an elderly woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and flour dusting her apron had been watching me. She was stout, with her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she moved with the efficiency of someone who had worked in the same spot for 50 years. Seeing my obvious distress, even after the small victory of the sale, she wiped her hands on her apron and bustled across the cobblestones. She stopped in front of me, looked down at my sketchbook, and then met my eyes. She said something in soft, musical Italian that I didn't understand, but the meaning was clear in her expression. She then pointed to her bakery and then to me, miming the act of drinking coffee. My eyes filled with tears. This simple, unsolicited act of kindness from a complete stranger was more overwhelming than all the cruelty I had endured. I nodded, unable to speak, and followed her back to her shop. The air inside was warm and heavenly, thick with the smell of yeast and sugar. She sat me at a tiny table, placed a steaming cappuccino and a flaky, cream-filled pastry in front of me, and refused to take any payment. Her name was Signora Sofia. We communicated with a clumsy mix of my broken high school Italian and her handful of English words, supplemented with a great deal of pointing and smiling. I didn't tell her my whole story, only that I was an artist and had found myself in some trouble. She just nodded, her gaze full of a wisdom that needed no translation. She looked through my sketchbook, her calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as they turned the pages. She would pause on a drawing, murmur "Bella," and pat my hand. When I was finished, she took 2 of my best sketches, one of the fountain and one of the old man's friend who had since joined him, and carefully taped them to the inside of her bakery's front window. She then took a small piece of cardboard, wrote 15 euros on it with a marker, and propped it next to them. She looked at me and smiled, a genuine crinkle-eyed smile. "You draw," she said, pointing at me, then pointing at the empty space on the fountain steps. "I sell." It wasn't a solution to my passport problem or my lack of a plane ticket home. But it was something more important. It was a foothold. It was a purpose. It was a stranger looking at me and seeing not a pathetic victim, but a person with a talent worth sharing. In the warm, fragrant sanctuary of that small Roman bakery, Ethan's cruel prank had given birth to its unintended consequence. A tiny, defiant spark of a new beginning. The next day was a repeat of the first, but with a thin, fragile layer of routine laid over the chaos. I sat on my designated step by the fountain, the sketchbook in my lap, and drew. Signora Sofia, my self-appointed guardian and agent, would bring me a bottle of cool water at noon and wave from her doorway. I sold 2 more small sketches, enough for another night at the convent, and a simple dinner of bread and cheese. I was living hour to hour, my existence pared down to its essentials, art and survival. It was late in the afternoon, when the Roman sun turns everything to gold, that I first saw him. He wasn't a tourist. He moved with the easy, confident stride of a man who owned the cobblestones he walked on. He was tall and lean, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored linen shirt and dark trousers. His dark hair was a little unruly, and he had the kind of intense, focused eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He bypassed the cafes and headed straight for Sophia's bakery. I watched as he greeted her with a familiar warmth, kissing her on both cheeks. Oh, a local, a friend. Then he saw the drawing in the window. It was a sketch I'd done that morning of the Fontana delle Tartarughe, one of my favorite hidden gems in the city. He stopped, his head tilted. From across the piazza, I saw his intense gaze soften with what looked like genuine appreciation. He said something to Sophia. Pointing at the sketch, she beamed with a proprietary pride, then turned and pointed a flour-dusted finger directly at me. My heart gave a nervous little leap. The man looked over, his eyes meeting mine across the square. He held my gaze for a moment, a look of frank curiosity on his face, before giving Sophia a crisp €20 note, taking the sketch, and walking out of the bakery. He didn't come over immediately. Instead, he stood for a moment, looking at the drawing in his hands, then back at me, as if weighing a decision. Finally, he crossed the piazza, his steps unhurried and deliberate. "This is your work?" he asked, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. His English was perfect, accented with the melody of his native Italian. I nodded, feeling suddenly shy. "Yes. You've captured its melancholy," he said, his eyes on the sketch. "Most people only see the whimsy of the turtles. They miss the sadness in the boys' faces. It takes an artist to see that." He looked up, and his dark eyes were warm and direct. "My name is Lorenzo." "Claire," I managed to say. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Claire. I own the restaurant across the way, La Lanterna Antica." He gestured with his head to an elegant establishment with dark green awnings and ivy crawling up the walls. It was the kind of place Ethan would have insisted on, a place I now felt I had no right to even look at. "I have been admiring your work in Signora Sophia's window. You have a great talent. There is a soul in your lines." Praise from a stranger, so genuine and specific, was a balm on my raw nerves. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He sensed my hesitation, my guardedness. His expression softened with a flicker of concern. "Signora Sophia tells me you are having some difficulties. A lost passport, perhaps?" I just nodded, the sanitized, simple version of the story already forming on my lips. "I see," he said. He didn't press for details. He didn't offer pity. Instead, his gaze became practical, yet kind. An artist cannot work on an empty stomach, and I cannot, in good conscience, have such a talented woman sitting on my doorstep without offering her a proper meal. "Please, allow me to thank you for the beautiful drawing. Be my guest for lunch." I started to refuse, the ingrained habit of not wanting to be a bother still strong, but he raised a hand. "It is not charity," he said firmly, as if reading my mind. "It is a professional courtesy. And besides, I have a feeling you have not had a good plate of pasta in a while." 5 minutes later, I was seated in a quiet corner of his beautiful sunlit restaurant. It was an oasis of calm, with white tablecloths, gleaming silverware, and the quiet hum of satisfied patrons. It felt like a world away from the convent and the fountain steps. Lorenzo didn't give me a menu. He simply disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a plate of handmade tagliatelle, tossed in a simple sauce of fresh cherry tomatoes and basil. It was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. As I ate, I told him the story I had prepared. My bag was stolen on the first day. Passport, wallet, phone, everything. The embassy was being slow, and I was just trying to make a little money to get by until they could issue new documents. It was all true, yet it was the biggest lie I had ever told, because it omitted the most important detail. The thief was my own husband. Lorenzo listened, his elbows on the table, his chin resting on his hands. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer facile solutions or expressions of sympathy. He just listened, his dark eyes watching me with an unnerving intensity, as if he could see the parts of the story I was leaving out. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. I braced myself for the pity, for the awkward offer of a loan. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and looked out the window towards the ancient city beyond. "Rome is not always a gentle city," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "She is old and sometimes cruel. She has a way of stripping you down to nothing, of showing you exactly who you are when all the comforts are gone." He turned his gaze back to me, and there was no pity in it, only a profound, surprising understanding. "But she also has a way of rewarding those who pass her tests, those who refuse to break." Lorenzo's words hung in the quiet air of the restaurant, a profound statement that seemed to reframe my entire ordeal. He saw it not as a personal failure, but as a crucible, a test. He then pushed his chair back, the spell broken, his demeanor shifting from philosophical to practical. "Come," he said, a new energy in his voice. "I want to show you something." He led me through the main dining room to a set of heavy wooden doors at the back. He pushed them open, revealing a beautiful, intimate space with a long table at its center, capable of seating 20, but the walls, painted a bland, neutral beige, were completely bare. "This is my private dining room, the sala privata," he explained, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "It is where I host my most important guests, where I test my most ambitious menus. But it has no story, it has no soul." He swept his arm around the room. "I want to change that. I am looking for something unique, not just decoration." He began to pace, his passion ignited. "My food is about history. I study ancient Roman recipes from the time of Apicius. I trace the journey of spices along the Silk Road, the arrival of the tomato from the New World. Every dish I create is a conversation with the past." He stopped and looked at me, his eyes burning with intensity. "I want that conversation to be on these walls. I want a mural that tells the story of Roman cuisine, from the feasts of Lucullus to the simple perfection of cacio e pepe. A visual history." As he spoke, the art historian in me awoke from its trauma-induced slumber. My mind began to race, picturing the frescoes of banquets in Pompeii, the medieval manuscripts illustrating harvests, the Renaissance paintings where food was a symbol of wealth and status. "You could show the evolution of bread," I heard myself say, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "From the simple flatbreads of the Republic to the enriched loaves of the Papal Court. Or the journey of pasta, the legends of Marco Polo versus the Etruscan tombs." I trailed off, embarrassed by my own sudden enthusiasm, but Lorenzo was smiling. A wide, genuine smile of pure delight. "Exactly," he exclaimed, pointing at me. "You see it. You understand. The story is already in your head." He took a deep breath, his expression turning serious. "I have been looking for an artist for 6 months. I've met a dozen. They all want to paint pretty pictures of grapes and wine bottles. They don't understand the history, the narrative." He paused, holding my gaze. "I want you to do it, Claire. I want you to paint the story on these walls." The air left my lungs. I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. "Me?" I said, the word a squeak. "Lorenzo, you've only seen a few of my charcoal sketches. I'm not a muralist. I don't have paints, supplies. I don't even know how long I'll be. I will buy you every paint, every brush, every canvas you need to practice." He interrupted, his confidence unwavering. "Charcoal, paint, it doesn't matter. The soul is in your lines. I can see it. As for how long you will be here, this is a major commission. It will take time. It is a legitimate reason for you to be in Rome. Something you can show to your embassy." He saw the fear and doubt warring on my face. The voice of Ethan was in my ear, whispering how I was just a hobbyist, how I would fail. Lorenzo seemed to hear it too. "Listen to me," he said, his voice softening. "This is a risk for me, yes. My reputation is tied to this restaurant, but my gut, my instinct, tells me you are the right person. In my business, I have learned to trust my gut above all else. He named a price for the commission that made my head spin. It was more money than I had made in the last 2 years of my part-time university lecturing. He said he would give me a quarter of it up front, as an advance, enough to find a small apartment, to live, to breathe. The offer was more than a lifeline. It was a whole new ship. It was payment, which meant independence. It was a purpose, which meant a reason to get out of bed every morning. It was a project, which meant a future. It was a stranger looking at the broken pieces of my life and seeing not a mess, but a masterpiece waiting to be created. Tears welled in my eyes, but for the first time in days, they were not tears of pain or fear. They were tears of overwhelming, shocking gratitude. Yes, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Okay, Lorenzo, yes. For the first time since Ethan had walked away from me in that crowded piazza, I felt a sense of agency, of hope. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a commissioned artist. My life began to revolve around the rhythms of La Lanterna Antica. I would arrive in the late morning, after the delivery trucks had come and gone, and work on my preliminary sketches at a small table in the corner of the main dining room. The staff, at first curious and distant, slowly began to accept me. The gruff head waiter, Massimo, would bring me coffee without me asking. The young pastry chef, Isabella, would bring me small, experimental desserts to try. They saw my work progressing, the walls of my notebook filling with vibrant, historical scenes, and their curiosity turned to respect. I spent my evenings in the Sala Privata after the last guests had left, surrounded by the ghosts of the day's service, the smell of garlic and wine, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the easy camaraderie of the staff as they shared a late-night meal. Lorenzo was a constant, supportive presence. He never hovered, but he was always there, bringing me a glass of wine, asking intelligent questions about my concepts, or just sitting in silence at the far end of the room, doing paperwork while I worked. He treated me not as a project or a charity case, but as a colleague, an equal. In the warm, creative, and respectful world of his restaurant, I wasn't just working on a mural. I was rebuilding myself, one brushstroke at a time. The next month was a blur of charcoal dust, the smell of linseed oil, and the taste of late-night espressos. I lived and breathed the mural. The beige walls of the Sala Privata became my world, a canvas onto which I poured everything I had. I painted the story of Roman food with a fervor born of desperation and newfound purpose. I depicted the simple, communal meals of the Etruscans, the opulent, spice-laden banquets of the Empire, the sparse but sacred bread of the early Christians, and the vibrant, tomato-rich dishes of the modern age. Every figure, every loaf of bread, every glistening fish was imbued with the pain, resilience, and burgeoning love I felt for the city that had broken me open, and was now putting me back together, stronger than before. My relationship with Lorenzo evolved as naturally as the scenes on the wall. Our late-night work sessions bled into conversations about art, history, and life. He would close the restaurant, pour 2 glasses of wine, and simply sit with me, watching, talking. He spoke of his childhood in Umbria, of learning to cook at his grandmother's side. I, in turn, spoke of my passion for art, for the stories hidden in plain sight. I didn't tell him the full truth about Ethan, the shame was still too raw, but I spoke of a marriage that had withered, of feeling unseen and unappreciated. He never pushed for more, but listened with a quiet, compassionate intensity that made me feel safe for the first time in years. On my rare days off, he became my guide to a secret Rome. He took me to the underground ruins of a Mithraic temple, its strange bull-slaying iconography hidden beneath the foundations of a basilica. He introduced me to an elderly artisan who still made mosaics using ancient Roman techniques. He showed me the view from the Janiculum Hill at sunrise. The entire city spread before us like a promise. With him, I wasn't a tourist seeing the sights. I was an explorer discovering the city's soul. With the advance Lorenzo had given me, I moved out of the convent and into a small but charming apartment near the Tiber. It had a tiny wisteria-draped balcony, A bedroom just big enough for a bed and a desk, and a temperamental hot water heater. It was the first space that was truly, completely mine. And I cherished it. I enrolled in an intensive Italian language school. The challenging grammar and vocabulary, a welcome distraction. Every new phrase I mastered was another brick in the foundation of my new life. The night I put the final brushstroke on the mural, Lorenzo stood beside me in the silent, finished room. The walls were alive, a vibrant, sweeping narrative of history and flavor. He didn't speak for a long time. He just walked the length of the room, his eyes tracing the stories I had painted. When he finally turned to me, his dark eyes were shining with an emotion that went far beyond professional appreciation. "Claire," he said, his voice thick, "you have not just decorated a room. You have given my restaurant its heart." The mural was an immediate sensation. Lorenzo hosted a small party to unveil it, inviting local food critics and journalists. They were captivated. An influential critic from La Repubblica wrote a glowing review, praising not only Lorenzo's latest menu but also the breathtaking historical narrative that diners can now feast their eyes upon. The Sala Privata became the most sought-after booking in Rome. The success was intoxicating, and it sparked an idea. One evening, as we celebrated the glowing review, I turned to Lorenzo. "People love the story on the walls," I said, a new confidence in my voice. "What if we took the story to the streets?" And so, Art and Appetizers was born. It was a venture that married our passions perfectly. 3 times a week, I would lead a small, exclusive tour group, no more than 8 people, through a specific art-focused itinerary. We would explore the hidden masterpieces of Caravaggio in a small church, or the pagan symbolism in a Renaissance chapel. I wasn't a guide reciting facts. I was a storyteller, bringing the art and the artists to life. The tour would culminate here, at La Lanterna Antica, where Lorenzo would have prepared a multi-course tasting menu, directly inspired by the art we had just seen. After a tour focusing on the decadent colors of Titian, he would serve a saffron risotto. After exploring the stark chiaroscuro of Caravaggio, a dish of squid ink pasta, it was an instant, runaway success. We were booked out months in advance. Tourists and locals alike clamored for a spot. My Italian was becoming fluent, my knowledge of the city was encyclopedic, and my confidence had solidified from a fragile spark into a steady, burning flame. I was no longer the woman Ethan had abandoned. I was the co-creator of one of the most unique cultural experiences in Rome. I wasn't just surviving anymore, subsisting on the kindness of strangers. I was building a business, a reputation, and a life that was rich and full and entirely my own. I was thriving. The day I held my new passport in my hand, I felt the last piece of the old Claire fall away. It was a simple document, but it was proof of my identity, my citizenship, my right to move through the world on my own terms. It was a key, and it was time to lock the door to my past. That afternoon, Lorenzo took me to meet his family's lawyer, Signora Moretti. She wasn't what I expected. She was a woman in her late 60s, impeccably dressed, with a mind as sharp as a stiletto. She worked out of an ancient, book-lined office that smelled of leather and lemon polish. I sat before her, not as a victim, but as a client. I laid out the entire story, from the lecture notes to the scavenger hunt to the cruel note left in the hotel. I provided the dates, the times, and the single damning piece of evidence I still had. A photo of the note I'd taken before throwing it away. Signora Moretti listened without interruption, her steepled fingers resting on her chin. Her expression was unreadable. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she gave a curt, decisive nod. "Abbandono del domicilio coniugale e crudeltà estrema," she said, her voice crisp. "Spousal abandonment and extreme cruelty. Under international marital law, and given the premeditated and malicious nature of your husband's actions, we have very strong grounds. We will file here, in Rome, the jurisdiction where the abandonment took place." She looked at me, a flicker of something like admiration in her shrewd eyes. "He wanted you to be helpless in a foreign land. We will use that foreign land to deliver his consequences." 2 weeks later, the gears of justice began to turn, 4,000 miles away. In Boston, Ethan Thompson was on top of the world. He was in the middle of his firm's open-plan office, a sleek glass and chrome cathedral to capitalism, regaling his junior analysts with a story. He was leaning against a desk, his suit jacket off, his sleeves rolled up, the picture of charismatic, casual authority. His audience was laughing at all the right moments. To them, he was the guy who had it all. A high-powered job, a corner office on the horizon, and a beautiful, if slightly eccentric, wife. For the past 2 months, he had been carefully crafting a narrative about my absence. Claire's on a bit of a European walkabout. He'd tell people with a knowing, indulgent chuckle, "You know how artists are. So passionate. We had a tiny spat before we were meant to leave, and she decided she needed some me time to find herself. She'll be back when she's done being dramatic." It was the perfect story. It painted him as the patient, understanding husband and me as a flighty, unreliable creative type. It had worked perfectly. He was just getting to the punchline of his story, when a man in an unremarkable gray suit stepped into the circle of analysts. He was of average height and build, the kind of man who was professionally invisible. "Ethan Thompson?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. Ethan's smile didn't falter. "That's me," he said, expecting a delivery or a message. The man held out a thick, legal-sized envelope. "You've been served," he said, his voice carrying just enough to silence the chatter of the nearby desks. He placed the envelope directly in Ethan's hand, turned, and walked away. The public nature of the act, the formal, unfamiliar words, sent a ripple of curiosity through the office. Ethan, ever the performer, laughed it off. "Looks like someone's unhappy with my fantasy football trades," he joked, but his smile was strained. He walked back to his glass-walled office, the envelope in his hand. Feeling the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes on his back, he sat down at his desk and tore it open, still expecting a subpoena for some minor corporate dispute. What he saw made the blood drain from his face. The documents were in both Italian and English. At the top, in stark, official font, were the words, "Tribunale Ordinario di Roma," the Court of Rome. And then he saw my name, the petitioner, and his own, the respondent. He read the grounds: spousal abandonment, extreme cruelty. His carefully constructed world began to dissolve. Attached to the legal filing was my sworn affidavit, a multi-page, detailed, and coldly factual account of his prank. It described the scavenger hunt, the disconnected phone, the cancelled hotel booking, the theft of my passport and money. It even included the verbatim text of the note he had left for me. The prank wasn't a secret joke anymore. It was Exhibit A in a legal proceeding, a testament to his calculated malice. He sat there, frozen, the papers shaking in his hand. The lie he had so carefully constructed had been obliterated by a single, transatlantic delivery. He was not the patient husband. He was the villain. Then, his phone, sitting on the polished surface of his desk, began to light up. It was my best friend, Sophie. He ignored the call. A moment later, a text from her. "I hope it was worth it." Then the phone rang again. My mother. He ignored it. Then his own mother. Her contact photo, a smiling, wholesome image that now seemed like an accusation. Then came the calls and texts from their friends. A flood of digital judgment. The news was spreading. A firestorm ignited by the legal documents. His cover story hadn't just been questioned. It had been executed in public. The isolation he had so brilliantly designed for me had boomeranged across the ocean and found its true target. He was the one who was now stranded, alone on an island of his own making, in the middle of his own life. The silence in Ethan's office was a living thing. A heavy, suffocating blanket woven from the whispers and averted gazes of his colleagues. The legal documents lay on his desk like a death certificate for the life he had known. But that silence was just the calm at the eye of the hurricane. Outside his glass walls, the storm was raging. The news spread through their social circles with the ruthless speed of a digital wildfire. Sophie, armed with the terrible validating truth she had suspected for years, became its primary accelerant. She didn't gossip. She conducted a campaign of quiet, factual dissemination. She called their 3 closest couple friends, her voice steady and somber. "I need to tell you what really happened to Claire," she would begin. And then she would lay out the facts of the prank with devastating precision. The story was so monstrous, so far beyond the pale, that it was instantly believed. There was no defending it. Condemnation was universal and swift. Phones buzzed across Boston, a web of interconnected shock and disgust. Ethan was no longer the charming rogue. He was a sociopath. He was a monster who had committed an act of unimaginable cruelty against his own wife. The indulgent chuckles that used to follow his stories of edgy humor were replaced with horrified silence. He had fundamentally misjudged his audience. His friends weren't cruel people. They had just been fooled by a cruel man. Now that the mask was off, they recoiled in unison. The professional fallout was just as brutal. The next morning, he was summoned to the office of his boss, Mr. Davies, a senior partner whose public image was built on integrity and family values. Davies' wife was the chairperson of a prominent Boston charity for abused women. When Ethan walked in, Davies didn't ask him to sit. He stood by the window, his back to Ethan, looking out over the city. "I received a call from my wife last night," Davies said, his voice dangerously calm. "She's on the board of a museum Claire sometimes consults for. She heard a story, Ethan. A story about Rome." He turned around, his face a mask of cold fury. "Tell me it's not true." Ethan opened his mouth, a dozen pathetic excuses dying on his lips. He saw in his boss's eyes that the truth was already set in stone. "It was a joke," he stammered, "a stupid, misguided prank that went wrong." "A prank," Davies repeated, the word dripping with contempt. "You abandon your wife in a foreign country, penniless and without a passport, and you call it a prank. This firm's reputation is built on trust. Our clients trust us with their life savings. How can I trust a man with our clients' money who treats his own family with such sociopathic disregard?" The promotion Ethan had been celebrating for months was officially given to a rival that afternoon. He was removed from the lucrative Henderson account, his flagship project. His new assignment was to conduct an internal review of past compliance protocols. It was a corporate Siberian salt mine, a meaningless, dead-end task designed to keep him out of sight and out of trouble until he had the decency to resign. His authority vanished overnight. Junior analysts who once hung on his every word now barely made eye contact. He was a ghost in his own office. His social life evaporated. The invitation to an upcoming wedding was rescinded via a terse, awkward email from the groom. The group chat for his weekly golf game went silent, and he discovered he had been quietly removed. Even his own family was appalled. His mother, after a tearful phone call with Claire's parents, called him, her voice trembling with shame. "I didn't raise you to be a cruel man, Ethan," she had cried. "I don't even know who you are." He was utterly alone, trapped in the beautiful Victorian house that now felt like a mausoleum. Every room was filled with the ghost of the woman he had discarded, and in his isolation, his confusion curdled into a desperate, narcissistic rage. He began to write emails to Claire. The first ones were furious, laced with vitriol and blame. "How dare you do this to me? You've destroyed my career, my reputation, all because you can't take a joke. You are the most selfish, vindictive person I have ever known. You're ruining my life." When rage didn't work, he turned to pathetic, cloying pleas. "Claire, baby, please talk to me. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I know I messed up. It was a stupid, stupid mistake. But I only did it because I was so stressed and I love you so much. I miss you. Please don't throw away 10 years of marriage over this." And when that failed, he resorted to gaslighting. His final, most familiar weapon. "Honestly, I think you're overreacting. It was a misunderstanding. If you weren't so sensitive, we could have just laughed about this. I'm willing to forgive you for embarrassing me like this, if you're willing to be reasonable, and come home so we can fix this. He would send them into the digital void, waiting, praying for a response. What he didn't know was that in Rome, Claire wasn't even seeing them. Following Signora Moretti's advice, she had set up a filter on her email account. Every desperate, manipulative message he sent was automatically, silently forwarded to a folder labeled Evidence. A folder her lawyer had full access to. He was screaming into a void. And every pathetic, self-pitying word was just another nail in his own coffin. 4 months later, the Victorian house in Brookline was no longer a home, it was a tomb. Ethan had been forced to resign from his job 2 weeks after the papers were served. His presence a toxic liability the firm could no longer afford. He now spent his days wandering the silent, empty rooms, the ghosts of a life he'd torched for a laugh, his only company. His desperate emails to me had gone unanswered, his pleas and threats vanishing into a digital abyss. He was a man adrift, stripped of his career, his friends, and his carefully constructed image. In the depths of his self-pity, a final, grandiose plan was born. He still believed, with the unshakable conviction of a true narcissist, that this was all a dramatic misunderstanding. He thought of me not as a woman who had moved on, but as his wife, staging an elaborate protest. He convinced himself that a single, powerful gesture was all it would take to shatter my resolve and bring me home. He would fly to Rome, surprise me, and the sheer force of his presence, his apology, his love, would rewind the clock. He booked a one-way ticket, still believing he was the hero of the story, coming to rescue the damsel from her self-imposed distress. Finding me was easier and, for him, more jarring than he had anticipated. There was no need for private detectives. A simple Google search of my name and Rome brought him to a sleek, professional website. Art and Appetizers, the banner read. An unforgettable journey into the heart of Roman art and cuisine. There were dozens of glowing reviews on travel sites, praising the brilliant insights of the tour guide, Claire Thompson. There were photos of me, smiling, surrounded by a rapt tour group. He stared at the images, a cold unease creeping into his heart. The woman in the photos looked happy, thriving. This was not the narrative he had written. He booked a tour under a false name. The confirmation email was prompt, polite, and professional. It told him the meeting point for the Caravaggio in Context tour, the steps of the Basilica di Sant'Agostino. He didn't join the group. Instead, he lurked, hiding behind a marble column like a common criminal. He watched as the small, exclusive group gathered. And then, he saw me. The sight was a physical shock. A punch to the gut that left him breathless. It was me, but it wasn't. The woman he remembered was cautious, her posture often subtly deferential to him. This woman stood tall, her shoulders back, her gestures open and confident. She was dressed in a simple but elegant linen dress, her face alive with a passion he had only ever seen her display for dusty old books. She greeted her tour group, her voice clear and carrying, effortlessly switching from fluent, laughing Italian with one couple to witty, articulate English for the others. She wasn't just reciting facts. She was weaving a story, her eyes alight, her audience utterly captivated. She was radiant. This confident, luminous woman was a complete stranger to him. He had thrown me into the fire, expecting me to be consumed by the flames. He never imagined I would emerge reborn, forged into something stronger and more brilliant than before. His shock curdled into a bitter, resentful jealousy. As the tour moved on, he followed at a distance, a pathetic shadow tailing a sunbeam. He watched as I led the group into the church, his own masterpiece of abandonment, and held them spellbound with a passionate lecture on the raw, brutal humanity of Caravaggio. As I finished and the group began to disperse, another blow landed. A man detached himself from the shadows near the church entrance, where he had clearly been waiting. It was Lorenzo. He didn't rush forward or make a scene. He just waited, and the look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated adoration. It wasn't the possessive pride Ethan had always felt for me. The pride of owning a beautiful object. This was the quiet, profound respect of a man witnessing the woman he loves in her element. I saw him, and a smile of genuine, unreserved joy lit up my entire face. A smile he hadn't seen directed at him in years. I walked over to Lorenzo, and he gently brushed a stray strand of hair from my cheek, his touch both familiar and tender. They spoke in low, laughing Italian, their intimacy as natural and easy as breathing. The sight of it was a dagger in Ethan's ego, twisting deep. He hadn't just been replaced. He had been rendered utterly irrelevant. This was the moment he chose to step forward from the ruins of his own making. He strode towards us, his face a mask of pained sincerity. "Claire?" he said, his voice husky with rehearsed emotion. I turned, and my smile didn't just vanish. It was instantly replaced by a look of cold, detached surprise, as if I were looking at a vaguely familiar stranger. He ignored Lorenzo completely, focusing his entire performance on me. He tried to take my arm, to pull me aside into our old, toxic bubble. "Claire, I had to come," he began, launching into the speech he had practiced 1,000 times on the flight over. "I've been in hell. Losing you, it's been the biggest mistake of my life. I was wrong, I was a fool, I was an idiot. I came all this way to tell you that I love you, and I know, deep down, you still love me. We can fix this. Please, just let me explain." Ethan's words, a torrent of practiced regret, washed over me without finding any purchase. He was performing, playing the role of the contrite husband, and he expected me to play my part, the tearful, wounded wife, overwhelmed by his grand gesture and ready to forgive. He was playing a scene from a movie that had ended months ago. I raised a hand. A simple, quiet gesture that cut through his monologue more effectively than a shout ever could. He stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open, utterly thrown by my refusal to follow the script. For the first time in our entire relationship, I looked at him not through a filter of love, or hope, or even anger, but with the cool, dispassionate clarity of a historian examining an artifact. I saw him for what he was. A hollow man, terrified of being unseen. The emotion that rose in me wasn't the rage he expected, nor the pain he secretly hoped for. It was a profound, weary pity. "Please stop, Ethan," I said, my voice steady and calm, devoid of the emotion he craved. "It's embarrassing." His face, which had been a mask of pained sincerity, flickered with confusion. "Embarrassing? I flew 4,000 miles for you, Claire. I'm bearing my soul here." "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You're not, you're just looking for a stage. Your stage in Boston went dark. So you came here, expecting the theater to still be open." I took a step back, creating a space between us that felt as wide as the Atlantic. Lorenzo stood a few feet away, silent and watchful, a guardian at the edge of my new world. "You didn't come here because you love me, Ethan," I continued, my voice gaining a strength I didn't know I possessed. "You have never understood what Love Island love is, respect. Love is partnership. Love is not abandoning someone you claim to care about as the punchline to a joke." He flinched, the word joke hitting him like a stone. "It was a mistake. How many times do I have to say I'm sorry?" "This isn't about your apology," I said, and this was the final, devastating truth. Your entire life is a performance, and you need someone in the front row, applauding. For 10 years that was me. Then it was your friends, your colleagues, your family. But the show is over. They've all walked out. The reviews are in, and they're terrible. So you came here, to the last person on earth you thought you could force to watch, to clap, to tell you that you're still the star. My voice was not cruel, merely factual. You didn't come here because you miss me. You came here because you missed the applause. He stared at me, his face a mess of disbelief and wounded pride. He was utterly defenseless against this kind of analysis. He was prepared for a fight, for tears, for drama. He was not prepared for a diagnosis. How can you be so cold?" he sputtered, reverting to his last resort. painting me as the villain. He reached for my arm again, his grip desperate. "This isn't you. This is him," he snarled, finally acknowledging Lorenzo with a jerk of his head. "He's turned you against me." I pulled my arm away. Not with a struggle, but with a finality that was absolute. I didn't even glance at Lorenzo. My new life didn't need a defender. It stood on its own. "Goodbye, Ethan," I said. And then I did the one thing he could never have anticipated. I turned my back on him and walked away. He called my name, his voice a pathetic, cracking plea. He started to follow, but Lorenzo simply shifted his weight, moving to stand in the space I had just vacated. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't say a threat. He was just an immovable object. A human wall between Ethan's dead past and my vibrant future. Ethan stopped, his path blocked. He looked at Lorenzo, a man who was everything he pretended to be. Confident, respected, and genuinely loved. He opened his mouth to say something. To rage. To threaten. But Lorenzo spoke first. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a final judgment. "La commedia è finita," he said. "The comedy is over." The words, in their perfect, simple finality, broke something in Ethan. He deflated, the last of his blustering, performative energy draining out of him. He looked from Lorenzo's implacable face to my retreating back. He was no longer the director of the play. He was just a forgotten actor on an empty stage, defeated, humiliated, and rendered utterly irrelevant on a public stage of his own making. Ethan was left standing alone in the middle of a Roman piazza. The tourists laughed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows from the ancient ruins, and the life of the city buzzed on around him. Completely indifferent to his existence, he was a ghost from a life he had single-handedly, and so stupidly, destroyed. 6 months later, the Roman twilight painted the sky in strokes of rose and lavender. I was sitting on the terrace of the apartment Lorenzo and I now shared, a beautiful space overlooking the terracotta rooftops of Trastevere. The scent of night-blooming jasmine drifted up from the courtyard below. My laptop was open. Not for frantic emails to a lawyer, but for finalizing the schedule for a new tour I'd designed. The Forgotten Queens of Rome. Our business was flourishing. Our life was a quiet, happy rhythm of shared passions and peaceful evenings. An email popped into my inbox, the subject line simple and final. Sentenza definitiva, Moretti. The final judgment. My heart gave a calm, steady beat. I clicked it open. Signora Moretti's message was brief and professional. The divorce was finalized. Due to the overwhelming and meticulously documented evidence of spousal abandonment, as well as Ethan's clumsy last-ditch attempts to hide financial assets from the court, the judgment had been overwhelmingly in my favor. The court had awarded me the full, unencumbered title to our house in Brookline, and a staggering 70% of our marital assets. Justice, it turned out, could be quantified. There was no triumphant fist pump, no shout of victory. Just a long, slow exhale. It was the breath I felt like I had been holding for 10 years. It was the sound of the last chain breaking. I spent the next hour online, not looking at real estate listings for myself, but researching charities. I found one in Boston that provided legal aid and emergency housing for women escaping abusive situations. I initiated a wire transfer, sending nearly half of the settlement to them as an anonymous donation. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about using its wreckage to build a future for someone else. Just as I closed my laptop, Lorenzo stepped onto the terrace, holding 2 flutes of chilled Prosecco, the bubbles dancing in the fading light. He handed one to me, his smile warm and easy. He had seen the email arrive and had known, without a word, what it meant. "A cosa brindiamo?" he asked softly. "What are we toasting to?" I looked out at the magnificent, ancient skyline of the city that had once been my prison and was now my home. I saw the distant dome of St. Peter's, the shadowy outlines of the hills, the 1,000 lights that were beginning to flicker on, each one a small story of a life being lived. I thought of the woman who had arrived here, full of a fragile, misplaced hope. I thought of the woman who had been left with nothing but her own spirit. And I thought of the woman I was now. A genuine, peaceful smile touched my lips. I raised my glass to meet his. Character building, I said. We clinked glasses, the clear, bright sound hanging for a moment in the warm evening air, before being carried away on the Roman breeze. Thank you for joining us for another episode of my channel. Claire's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes, the cruelest acts of others can become the catalyst for our greatest liberation. What Ethan intended as a prison became Claire's proving ground, showing that the best revenge isn't loud and explosive, but is found in building a life so full of joy, success, and love that the past simply has no place to live. What did you think of Ethan's karmic downfall? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, so you never miss a story of satisfying justice.